It's either really sad or mostly sad. I was lying in bed last night, awake, thinking about fuzz pedals, specifically fuzz faces, and thinking about the bias of fuzz faces. Now, people consider the sweet spot on a fuzz face to be 4.5 volts. And the way manufacturers have attacked bias over the years is very different now as opposed to the 60s. So in the 60s, you would have got a fuzz much like this. You can't buy one of these. This is a custom New Markets fuzz face made by Spruce Effects. And the bias control is on the inside. And that's the only way that I can adjust it. Got to get out a multimeter. We'll talk about that later. Then there are some manufacturers who attack bias. Again, this is Spruce. It's just a different design. Bias is on the front there, so you can adjust the bias on the fly. It doesn't really tell you when you hit that 4.5 sweet spot, but it gives you the ability to go outside of the sweet spot as much or as little as you would like. And then in 2021, Benson Amps came out with the Germanium fuzz, which is a temperature controlled fuzz and keeps it at the sweet spot all the time. And then following that, Silktone Amps came out with the Silktone fuzz. And this has a bias control right here, but there's a little meter there so you know when you're hitting the sweet spot or going beyond it. So I wanted to take today to go through different methods of checking bias and also what it does, because essentially you can make a fuzz face into a lot of different fuzzes just by changing the bias. So let's go. So before we dive into bias, we should probably understand what bias is. And I asked my friend John Snyder over at Electronic Audio Experiments, who has a PhD in electrical engineering. I asked him what the bias does, and I actually printed out what he said because I thought it was brilliant. He says, 99% of the time, when you're dirtying up a guitar signal, you use some kind of amplifier to push it beyond its limits and get fun results. When a signal can't get amplified anymore, it changes. You get overdrive, distortion, and eventually fuzz as you keep pushing. Every amplifier has some optimal idling conditions, otherwise known as the bias point. Normally, the bias point is set to deliver maximum headroom or power output, but you can also deliberately set a non-optimal bias to get interesting results by pushing an amplifier's limits in new ways. The overarching theme of this is that guitarists like to break stuff to make it gooder. So let's do just that. If your fuzz face does not have a bias control in the front, which is actually most of them, including the original, doesn't mean that you can't check the bias and change the bias. The way you change the bias is usually on a trim pot on the inside. This one is right here. And then you just would measure the voltage going through the transistors. So this is one here. We can check one side of it and the other. And that brings us to 3.68 resting, which is not in the 4.5 range, which is kind of the sweet spot for these. So let's check that again. Went the wrong way, so we want to go the other direction. All right, so here we got a pretty solid 4.62 resting, which is actually where I'm gonna leave it, because that is close enough. All right, so I grabbed myself a F-style, S-style guitar here because it's the right thing to do when you're playing with fuzz faces. And this one here is made by Sife Guitars. And I am running into a Benson Amps Monarch Reverb. All right, so what I have here is I have the Silktone Fuzz, and the reason we're using the Silktone Fuzz is because it has that handy dandy meter on the front, so we can look at what it's like when you go in either direction, taking a fuzz face outside of its intended bias point of 4.5. So we'll pull it on here. I also want to note, as you're turning this and as you're playing, the numbers do change because electricity is flowing through it and it's an imperfect thing. But when we talk about setting the base bias point, we're talking about setting the resting rate. So 4.5 here. Is the sound that we are all super familiar with. That is the fuzz face in its zone. What happens if we take it out of the zone? What if we go below the zone? Again, what happens if we go above the optimal zone? So that was very different, right? Once you got on either side of that 4.5, when you went below, you starved the circuit, which gave you that really cool gated sound that we've heard on a lot of different records. And that is one of my favorite fuzz sounds, just real choked out fuzz sound. And then once we went over, it was almost too much, and it felt like there was just too much stuff trying to go through the transistor, and so you would get things farting out and things like that, and it was not a great sound. But I do like when you under bias a fuzz face. I do like that sound a lot, and maybe you do like the sound of an over biased fuzz face. This is just a ton of fun for me. I love fuzzes, and I love working with fuzzes and thinking about fuzzes and talking about fuzzes and playing through fuzzes, so this is a blast. Until next time, friends, I will see you when I see ya.